Simple Spoken English presents A Journey of Determination, How One Man Mastered English and Changed His Life. Welcome to Simple Spoken English, your trusted companion on the journey to learning English fluently and confidently. Today we bring you an inspiring story about perseverance, dedication, and transformation. This is the tale of a man who overcame countless challenges to master the English language, unlocking new opportunities and changing his life forever. If you've ever struggled with learning English or doubted your ability to succeed, this story will show you that with determination, anything is possible. So, get comfortable, and let's dive into this remarkable journey of hope and success. The beginning of a struggle. John was born in a quiet, remote village nestled amidst the green fields of Uttar Pradesh, India. Life in his village was simple but harsh. John's father, a hard-working farmer, spent most of his day toiling in the fields under the burning sun. His mother, a soft-spoken woman, cared for the family's home and managed their small, struggling household. They were not wealthy, but they were content. From an early age, John was aware of the challenges his family faced. There was never enough money for luxuries like toys or treats. Clothes were passed down from older siblings, patched and worn. John did not mind this. He was a quiet boy, curious and observant, who loved to sit under the neem tree near his home and dream about the future. His family sent him to the nearest government school. Education there was basic. Teachers were often absent, and when they did come, they focused more on memorization than understanding concepts. Classes were conducted in John's native language, Hindi, except for one subject, English. The moment the English teacher entered the room, John's heart would sink. English was like a strange, alien language to him. It didn't sound like the words his family used, nor did it feel familiar like the songs sung during festivals. His first encounter with English was when his teacher wrote the word apple on the blackboard. "Repeat after me," the teacher said. "A for apple." The whole class chanted, "A for apple." John's voice, however, was the weakest. He felt the weight of the letters on his tongue. It was as though his mouth refused to cooperate with his mind. The embarrassment continued as the teacher called him to read from the English textbook. John stared at the page. The letters seemed to dance in front of his eyes, mocking him. "Read, John," the teacher said impatiently. I can't, sir," John stammered. His classmates erupted into laughter. From that day, John dreaded English lessons. Every time the teacher asked questions, he would look down at his desk, praying not to be noticed. But no matter how much he avoided it, English was everywhere. It was in the alphabets on school posters, the names of grocery items, and even the songs played at weddings. John knew that ignoring it would not make it disappear. His struggles continued through primary school and into high school. He was a bright student when it came to subjects like mathematics and science, where understanding concepts mattered more than words. Yet English remained his Achilles heel. Every exam season, he would pass by scraping the bare minimum marks in English. One day, his English teacher scolded him in front of the class. "You'll never succeed in life if you can't even learn English. It's the language of opportunity. The word stung John like a slap. The language of opportunity, he thought. He didn't understand what that truly meant at the time, but something about it bothered him. He carried those words home that day, replaying them in his mind as he sat under the neem tree. Why does English matter so much? He wondered. It was a question that stayed with him as he grew older. His parents, too, never pushed him to learn it. They were content as long as he completed his schooling and found some form of work. But John was beginning to see a world beyond his village, one where English seemed like a golden key. High school and the pressure of expectations. By the time John reached high school, life began to change. Friends started talking about college, cities, and big dreams. Some of his classmates discussed their plans to become engineers, doctors, or government officers. John listened quietly. He wanted to dream big, too. But every time he imagined himself in a city or an office, one fear held him back. What if someone asks me to speak in English? John had seen older boys from his village return from the city, dressed in smart clothes and speaking fluent English. They were treated with respect by everyone. People looked up to them as though they had achieved something extraordinary. One evening, John overheard two elders talking about one such boy. That Ramesh has become a big officer now, all because he knows English. Without it, where would he be? Those words planted a seed in John's mind. He realized that English was not just a subject in school. It was a bridge to something bigger. Yet, even with this realization, his fear of English remained. During his final year of high school, John experienced another blow. The school had organized a farewell ceremony, and students were asked to speak a few words in English on stage. John's name was announced, but he froze. His palms grew sweaty, his heart raced, and his legs felt like they would give way. He walked to the stage and stood in front of the microphone. The silence was unbearable. Every eye in the hall was fixed on him. "Hello," he managed to say. His voice cracked, and a wave of laughter rippled through the crowd. That moment broke John. Tears welled in his eyes as he stepped down from the stage. For the first time, he felt ashamed of himself. He avoided his friends for days after the incident, unwilling to face their teasing or questions. Maybe I'm not meant for this world, John thought. I'll just find work in the village and forget about dreams. Realizing the importance of English, John eventually passed his final exams and completed school. He was proud of his efforts, but deep down, he knew something was missing. His grades were average, and his confidence was shattered. He decided to leave the village and move to the city to find work. The city was unlike anything John had imagined. It was loud, fast, and overwhelming. Tall buildings stretched toward the sky, and people hurried past him, speaking languages he didn't understand. But what struck him the most was how often he heard English. At the railway station, announcements were made in English. At restaurants, people placed their orders in English. Even shopkeepers greeted customers with, "Hello! How can I help you?" John felt like an outsider. No matter where he turned, English was there, a constant reminder of his greatest weakness. He applied for jobs at small stores and hotels, but every interview ended the same way. "Do you speak English?" Each rejection cut deeper than the last. John started to lose hope. One evening, he sat alone on a bench in a busy park. Watching people laugh, talk, and live their lives made him feel invisible. He thought about his parents, who had believed in him. "Maybe I should go back to the village," he whispered to himself. Just then, an old man sat down beside him. The man had a kind face, and his eyes seemed to understand John's pain. "What's troubling you, son?" the man asked gently. John hesitated, but then the words spilled out. "I can't speak English, sir. I can't get a job because of it. I feel useless." The old man nodded, listening carefully. Then he smiled and said something that would change John's life forever. "Son, English is just a skill, like riding a bicycle or planting a seed. You can learn it one step at a time. It's never too late to start. Remember, you're not useless. You're just at the beginning of your journey." For the first time in weeks, John felt a spark of hope. "Maybe I can learn it," he thought, and from that moment, his life began to change. Part 2. Facing Reality. John woke up the next morning with the old man's words ringing in his ears. "English is just a skill, like riding a bicycle or planting a seed. You can learn it one step at a time." Those simple words felt like a lifeline. For years, John had seen English as a mountain too steep to climb, but now a small hope flickered inside him. He realized something important. It's not that I can't learn English. It's that I never really tried. That day marked the beginning of his new journey, but before he could take the first step, he needed to confront reality. John sat on his bed, staring at the worn-out notebook he used in school. He had no job, no money for expensive coaching classes, and no one to teach him. He lived in a tiny rented room in the city with a leaky roof and no fan. But despite these challenges, his determination grew stronger. Step 1. A plan with no resources. John started small. He needed to break this mountain into manageable steps, so he decided to follow a simple routine. 1. Learn 5 new English words every day. 2. Practice speaking short sentences, no matter how broken they were. 3. Listen to people speaking English even if he didn't understand. He borrowed an old, tattered English-Hindi dictionary from a friend. The pages were torn and the cover was falling apart, but it was a treasure to John. He sat down and opened the first page. The word apple was there. "Apple," John whispered. "It means Seb." Slowly, he wrote it in his notebook. Under it, he wrote a sentence. "This is an apple." It was such a simple thing, just a word and a sentence, but it gave John hope. He started waking up at 5 a.m. every day, sitting on the floor of his room and learning his 5 words. Day 1. Apple, Seb, table, mez, chair, kursi, door, darwaza, water, pani. John practiced saying these words aloud, even though it felt strange. He imagined conversations in his head where he would use these words: "Please give me water. This is a table." Step 2. Speaking without fear. One of John's biggest fears was speaking in English. For years he avoided it because he was afraid of making mistakes. People had laughed at him before, and he didn't want to feel that humiliation again. But now, John made a promise to himself. It's okay to make mistakes. Every mistake will teach me something new. He decided to practice speaking English with strangers. He started with the small tea shop near his house. The shop owner was an elderly man who was kind and patient. One morning, John walked into the shop, clutching his notebook tightly. His heart was pounding, but he took a deep breath and said, "Good morning. Tea, please." The shop owner looked up, surprised but smiling. "Good morning, Beta. One tea coming right up." John smiled back. It was a simple interaction, but to him it was like winning a battle. He repeated this every day, adding more words and sentences. Struggles and frustration. While John made small progress, he faced many struggles. Some days, he couldn't remember the words he had learned. Other times, he mixed up sentences and felt foolish. Once, he went to a small grocery shop and said, "I want 2 breads." The shopkeeper laughed and corrected him. "2 loaves of bread, bhaiya, not 2 breads." John felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment, but instead of giving up, he wrote the mistake in his notebook that night. Correct. 2 loaves of bread. Every mistake became a lesson. John treated his notebook like a journal of growth, filling it with corrections, new words, and sentences. That's a ray of hope. John's routine continued for weeks. By now, he had learned over 200 new words and could form simple sentences. He didn't sound fluent, but his confidence grew. He started listening to English songs and watching small clips of people speaking English on an old, borrowed phone. One day, while sitting in a park, John noticed a group of children playing. A small boy ran up to him and said, "Uncle, what is your name?" John hesitated, but smiled. He replied slowly, "My name is John." "What is your name?" The boy laughed and replied, "My name is Kunal." It was a short exchange, but John felt proud. He realized something important. Language is about communication. It's okay if I'm not perfect, as long as I try. Facing society's judgment. Not everyone was supportive of John's journey. Some of his friends laughed when they heard him speaking broken English. "Why are you wasting time on this?" they said. "You'll never speak fluently like city people." Their words hurt, but John reminded himself why he started. He remembered the old man's words. It's never too late to start. One evening, while walking back from the market, John overheard 2 men talking in English. They were discussing a movie they had watched. John didn't understand everything, but he caught words like good, hero, and ending. Someday, John thought, I will join conversations like these. That night, John sat in his room and wrote in his notebook, "I can, I will, I must." The power of consistency. Weeks turned into months, and John's consistency began to pay off. He could now introduce himself, ask simple questions, and talk about basic topics like food, family, and daily life. One day, his landlord, who spoke good English, asked him, "John, you are learning English. Why?" John replied proudly, "I want to change my life. I want to speak English fluently." The landlord nodded approvingly and said, "Good. Don't stop trying. You're doing well." For the first time, someone had recognized his efforts. It gave John a boost of motivation to keep going. Looking ahead, John's journey had just begun, but he was already a different person. He no longer avoided English. He embraced it one step at a time. He had a clear plan, a growing vocabulary, and most importantly, a never-give-up attitude. Looking at the world around him, John saw opportunities where he once saw obstacles. English was no longer a monster to him. It was a bridge, and he was determined to cross it. As he sat on the same park bench where he had met the old man months earlier, John whispered to himself, "This time next year I will speak English fluently." And with that thought, he opened his notebook and wrote down 5 new words to learn. Part 3. A New Beginning. The old man's words had ignited something powerful inside John, but a fire needs fuel to keep burning. John knew that if he wanted to succeed, he had to stay committed to his daily learning routine. His first few weeks of learning English had given him hope, but now he faced a new challenge: how to learn faster and more effectively while managing his circumstances. 1. Building a stronger routine. John's rented room was small and dark, but it became his classroom. His tools were simple: a notebook, a borrowed dictionary, and an old phone his friend lent him. The phone had no internet connection, but John discovered a brilliant way to use it. Record his voice. Every morning, John would stand in front of the mirror and speak the words and sentences he had learned the previous day. He would record himself, play it back, and listen. "My name is John. I am learning English. I will speak English fluently one day." Hearing his voice made John cringe at first. He didn't like his pronunciation, but slowly he saw improvement. He realized that speaking out loud, no matter how strange it felt, was helping him grow confident. Make word cards. John cut pieces of paper into small cards and wrote English words on one side and their Hindi meanings on the other. Every day he carried a handful of cards in his pocket and reviewed them whenever he found time, in line at the market, waiting for tea, or sitting in the park. John stuck to his new, disciplined routine. Morning. Learn 5 new words and practice them in sentences. Afternoon. Read English posters or signs he saw in the city and try to understand them. Evening. Speak simple sentences to anyone willing to listen: shopkeepers, strangers, or children in the park. Night. Write down everything he had learned that day in his notebook. This daily practice became John's anchor. No matter how tired or discouraged he felt, he never skipped a day. He would whisper to himself, "One day, this effort will change my life." 2. The fear of speaking in public. John's greatest hurdle remained speaking in public. While his vocabulary was growing and he could form basic sentences, speaking in front of others terrified him. He feared the same laughter and humiliation he had faced in school. One afternoon, while sitting in the park, John watched a group of men arguing about cricket. He realized they were speaking in a mix of English and Hindi. John didn't understand every word, but he caught phrases like, "The player is excellent. He should have scored more runs." John wanted to join the conversation, but doubt crept in. What if they laugh at me? He sat frozen until a young boy playing nearby accidentally kicked a ball toward him. The boy, smiling shyly, said, "Uncle, please give ball." John took a deep breath and replied, "Here is your ball. Be careful." The boy beamed and said, "Thank you." That small interaction gave John courage. If I can talk to a child, I can talk to others too. The next day, John decided to visit a local library. He had heard that libraries were places where people spoke softly and politely, making it less intimidating. The librarian, a kind elderly woman, asked, "What do you want, young man?" John hesitated but replied slowly, "I want to learn English books." The librarian smiled warmly and handed him a children's storybook. It had simple sentences, colorful pictures, and words John could recognize. "Start with this," she said. John nodded gratefully and spent hours reading that book aloud in a quiet corner of the library. Sentences like, "The sun rises in the east." "This is a cat. The cat is small." These lines seemed simple, but they helped John. He realized that reading aloud improved his pronunciation, his rhythm, and his confidence. 3. Facing mockery. Again, while John was progressing, not everyone supported him. Some of his old friends teased him when they heard him speaking broken English. "John, who are you fooling? You'll never speak like the city people." Their words hurt, but John remembered the old man's advice. Mistakes are proof you are learning. Don't let anyone stop you. That evening, John sat in his room and wrote in his notebook, "I will prove them wrong. My mistakes will make me better." The next day, he visited a small English coaching center in his neighborhood. John couldn't afford classes, but he asked the teacher if he could sit quietly and listen. The teacher, seeing John's determination, agreed. For weeks, John sat at the back of the class, absorbing everything he heard. He paid attention to how words were pronounced, how sentences were formed, and how confidence made all the difference. At night, he practiced those lessons in his tiny room. 4. A surprise opportunity. One evening, while walking back from the market, John saw a notice on a wall. "English-speaking competition, open to all." The words caught his attention. There was a prize, a free English-speaking course at a renowned institute. John's heart raced. Could I do this? What if I fail? For days he debated whether to join. The fear of standing on stage again brought back memories of his school humiliation. But then, he thought about everything he had learned in the past few months. "I may not win," John told himself, "but I can try." 5. Preparing for the competition. For 2 weeks, John prepared a short speech titled, "Why I Want to Learn English." He practiced in front of the mirror, recording himself on the old phone and correcting his mistakes. His speech was simple. "Good morning. My name is John. I am learning English because it will help me in life. I want to get a good job, help my family, and speak confidently. English is hard for me, but I am trying every day. If I can learn, anyone can learn. Thank you." 6. The big day. The day of the competition arrived. John wore his best clothes, a clean white shirt and neatly ironed pants. He looked in the mirror and whispered, "You can do this." At the venue, John saw young men and women confidently practicing their speeches. Doubt crept in, but he reminded himself, every master was once a beginner. When his name was called, John walked to the stage. His hands trembled and his heart pounded in his chest. The audience was silent, waiting. John took a deep breath and began, "Good morning. My name is John." The words came slowly but clearly. John looked up and saw people nodding, listening to him. By the time he finished, the room erupted into applause. John didn't win the first prize that day, but he won something far greater: respect and confidence. The judge told him, "You have great potential, young man. Keep practicing and you will go far." Conclusion of Part 3. That evening, John sat under the same park tree where he had once cried over his failures. Now he held his certificate of participation proudly. For the first time, he believed in himself. His journey was far from over, but he had taken a giant step forward. He looked up at the sky and whispered, "I will not stop. One day, I will speak English fluently." Part 4. Struggles and Small Victories. John's journey was far from over, but something had changed within him after the English-speaking competition. Though he didn't win, standing on stage and speaking even broken English gave him a sense of pride. It was a small victory, but for John, it meant progress. That evening, as he walked back to his small rented room, John's mind was filled with thoughts. I didn't fail. I spoke. They listened. I need to keep going. From that day forward, John's routine became even more disciplined. He woke up earlier, practiced harder, and sought every possible opportunity to improve. However, learning English was still a challenge. And challenges, John soon realized, came in many forms. 1. The challenge of pronunciation. One evening, John visited the small grocery shop near his house. He had started using simple English phrases to interact with the shopkeeper. This time, he tried to say, "Can I get a packet of biscuits?" But the way John pronounced biscuits came out as biscuits, a literal pronunciation that sounded odd. The shopkeeper, a man who spoke broken English himself, laughed gently. "Bhaiya, you mean biscuits, not biscuits?" John felt embarrassed, but instead of running away, he smiled and repeated, "Biscuits. Thank you, Bhaiya." That night, John added a new section to his notebook titled Pronunciation Corrections. He began to focus on words that confused him. Schedule. Was it schedule or schedule? Comfortable. Not comfortable, but comfortable. vegetable, not vegetable, but vegetable. To improve, John borrowed an old radio from his landlord and listened to English news channels. The reporters spoke in clear, formal English. At first, John struggled to keep up, but slowly he began to recognize how words sounded when spoken naturally. He would repeat sentences he heard. "Good evening, this is the news at 9. He practiced saying them aloud, recording himself and correcting his pronunciation. Each day his voice became clearer, his speech smoother. 2. Reading. A door to new worlds. One day, John returned to the library where he had borrowed his first children's book. The librarian, impressed with John's progress, handed him a simple English newspaper. "Try reading this, John," she said. John stared at the newspaper. The words looked difficult, but he took it as a challenge. That evening he sat in his room with the newspaper spread before him. He read slowly, stopping often to look up meanings in his dictionary. The headline read, "A new bridge opens in the city today." John broke it down word by word. Bridge, a structure for crossing over. Opens, to start working or functioning. He wrote the sentence in his notebook and practiced saying it aloud. This exercise became part of his daily routine. John would spend an hour every evening reading simple articles, focusing on understanding the main idea rather than every single word. Over time, reading became a joy for John. He discovered that newspapers, storybooks, and even pamphlets were doors to new worlds, worlds where English wasn't scary anymore. 3. Speaking with confidence. John's growing vocabulary and improved pronunciation gave him a newfound confidence to speak. He realized that fluency wasn't about being perfect. It was about communicating clearly. One afternoon, while waiting at the bus stop, a young man approached John and asked, "Excuse me, do you know where the post office is?" John's heart raced. He hesitated for a moment, but then he replied slowly, "Yes. Go straight, then left. Post office is there." The man smiled and said, "Thank you." John beamed with pride. This small interaction was a big step for him. He realized that even broken English could be useful if spoken with confidence. To build his fluency further, John started visiting local English-speaking meetups organized at the library. These informal groups welcomed anyone who wanted to practice English. At first, John was nervous. He listened more than he spoke, but soon he began participating. He introduced himself confidently. "My name is John. I am learning English. I want to improve." The group members encouraged him, corrected his mistakes gently, and helped him form better sentences. 4. Facing mockery. A new attitude. Not everyone admired John's efforts. Some of his old friends continued to mock him. "John, why are you trying so hard? You'll never speak English like those rich city people." This time John didn't feel hurt. Instead, he replied calmly, "Maybe. But every day I am better than I was yesterday." Their laughter didn't bother him anymore. John had learned an important lesson. The journey is mine, not theirs. 5. Helping others and learning more. As John's English improved, he noticed something interesting. Many people in his neighborhood wanted to learn English, too. Children struggled with their homework, and adults wanted to speak English at work or with their customers. One evening, a small boy named Arjun approached John and asked shyly, "Bhaiya, can you help me with my English homework?" John smiled and said, "Yes, of course." For the first time, John found himself teaching English to someone else. It was challenging, but it helped him reinforce his own learning. When Arjun got better marks in school, his parents thanked John and said, "You should teach more children, John. You're doing a great job." This idea planted a new seed in John's heart. 6. A letter of opportunity. Months later, John received exciting news. The English-speaking course he had competed for earlier was offering free enrollment to a limited number of students. John's name was on the list because of his participation in the competition. It felt like a dream come true. The course would give him access to proper classes, teachers, and materials, things he had always wanted but couldn't afford. On the first day of the course, John sat in a classroom with students of all ages. The teacher entered and said, "Welcome, everyone. Remember, learning English is a journey, and you are already on your way." John smiled to himself. He knew this was true. So the power of small victories. By now, John could hold basic conversations, read newspapers, and help children with their homework. He still made mistakes, but he wasn't afraid anymore. Each mistake brought him closer to fluency. His journey was no longer just about learning English. It was about becoming a better, more confident version of himself. One evening, as John sat in his room revising his lessons, he looked at the old notebook that had started it all. It was full of words, sentences, corrections, and small victories. He whispered to himself, "I will speak English fluently, not someday, but soon." Part 5. The Turning Point. John's journey had been filled with struggles, failures, and small victories. Each day had been a battle, but his determination carried him forward. By now, John's confidence had grown, and his ability to speak English, though not perfect, had improved dramatically. He could introduce himself, hold short conversations, and even read simple newspapers. However, life was about to present him with his biggest opportunity and his greatest test. 1. A job interview. The real challenge. One afternoon, while John was helping young Arjun with his homework, his landlord knocked on the door. "John, there's a job opening at a big hotel. They need a receptionist. You should apply." John froze. A receptionist's job meant interacting with customers, many of whom would speak English. It was a golden opportunity, but fear tugged at his heart. What if I fail again? The landlord smiled and added, "You've worked so hard, John. Don't let fear stop you now." That night, John couldn't sleep. He sat on his bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about his journey. He remembered all the nights he had spent learning new words, all the times he had corrected his mistakes, and all the small victories that had brought him here. "I can do this," John whispered. "I have come too far to stop now." The next morning, John ironed his best shirt, combed his hair neatly, and walked into the hotel for the interview. As he sat in the waiting area, he looked around. Other candidates were dressed in polished suits and seemed confident, speaking fluently in English. John felt small, but he reminded himself, "I am not here to compete with them. I am here to show what I can do." When his turn came, John entered the interview room. The manager, a sharp-looking man, smiled and said, "Good morning. Please introduce yourself." John took a deep breath and said slowly, "Good morning, sir. My name is John. I am from Uttar Pradesh. I have learned English by myself, and I want to work hard to help your customers." The manager raised his eyebrows. "You learned English by yourself?" "Yes, sir. I read books, practiced speaking, and listened to English every day. I know I am not perfect, but I will do my best to improve." The manager paused for a moment, then asked, "Why do you want this job?" John replied honestly, "This job will help me support my family. It will also help me improve my English and gain confidence. I want to learn and grow, sir." The manager smiled and said, "You are not perfect, John, but you are determined. We need people like you." John couldn't believe his ears. "Congratulations, John. You got the job." Tears welled in his eyes as he thanked the manager repeatedly. It was a moment John would never forget, proof that his efforts had paid off. 2. The first day at work. John's first day as a hotel receptionist was filled with nervous excitement. He wore his uniform proudly and stood behind the reception desk. The manager had instructed him, "Greet every guest in English. Be polite and smile. That's all you need to do." The first guest walked in, a middle-aged man with a suitcase. John's hands trembled as he greeted him. "Good morning, sir. Welcome to our hotel. How can I help you?" The man replied, "I have a reservation." John quickly checked the register and said, "Yes, sir. Your room is ready. Please sign here." The guest smiled and said, "Thank you." That small interaction filled John with pride. By the end of the day, John had greeted over 20 guests, managed their check-ins, and answered simple questions, all in English. He stumbled a few times, but his colleagues encouraged him. One of them, Ramesh, said, "You're doing great, John. You'll be fluent in no time." John's confidence grew with every passing day. 3. Inspiring others. As weeks turned into months, John became one of the most reliable employees at the hotel. His English had improved tremendously. He could hold longer conversations, handle customer complaints, and even help guests from other countries. One day, while sitting in the staff break room, a young waiter named Aman approached John. "Bhaiya, how did you learn English? I want to learn too." John smiled and said, "I learned one word at a time. You can do it too." From that day, John began helping Aman. They sat together during lunch breaks, and John taught him new words and phrases. Soon, other staff members joined them. John's small teaching sessions became popular, and he was known as the English guru among his colleagues. 4. Returning to his village. A year later, John returned to his village to visit his family. When he stepped off the bus, he saw the same familiar fields, the same old neem tree and the same narrow paths. But something had changed. John had changed. His parents were overjoyed to see him. At dinner, John spoke to them about his job, his experiences, and his journey of learning English. His younger cousins listened with wide eyes, amazed to hear John speak fluently. The next day, villagers gathered around him and asked, "John, how did you learn English? We heard you work in a big hotel now." John smiled and said, "I learned one step at a time. Anyone can do it if they try. You just have to start." Inspired by John's story, a few villagers approached him, asking for tips to learn English. John spent his evenings teaching children and adults how to introduce themselves, form simple sentences, and build confidence. 5. John's dream, a new mission. As John sat under the neem tree one evening, he thought about how far he had come. From a boy who couldn't say hello to a man who now taught others, John's journey was nothing short of incredible. But John wasn't satisfied. He had a new dream. "I want to open an English coaching center in my village. I want to help others who struggled like me." He knew it wouldn't be easy, but if his journey had taught him one thing, it was this: with hard work, anything is possible. Conclusion: a message for you. John's story is not just about learning English. It's about determination, consistency, and the belief that no dream is too big if you take small steps every day. John's message for all of you is simple. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Don't be afraid to start small. English, or any skill, can be learned if you practice every day. If I can do it, so can you. Final words. Friends, thank you for watching Simple Spoken English. I hope John's story inspired you to take the first step toward your goals. Remember, small efforts every day lead to big results. If you like this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.